The small town of Millbrook had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Main Street stretched only 4 blocks, lined with aging storefronts and a few local businesses that had been there for decades. At the heart of it all sat Ruby's Diner, a modest establishment with red vinyl booths and checkered floors that had served the community for over 30 years. Ruby Henderson, 73 years old with silver hair always pinned back in a neat bun, had owned and operated the diner since her late husband passed away. She was known throughout town for her warm smile, generous portions, and the way she remembered every customer's favorite order. Despite her advancing age, Ruby insisted on working every day, arriving before dawn to prepare the fresh coffee and homemade pies that kept locals coming back. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, the autumn air carried a crisp promise of the changing season. Ruby moved slowly but steadily around the diner, her arthritic hands carefully arranging sugar packets and wiping down tables. The morning rush had been busier than usual, with construction workers stopping by before heading to the new housing development on the outskirts of town. Sheriff Marcus Dalton had been having one of his worst weeks in recent memory. 3 break-ins had occurred in the past month, and the town council was breathing down his neck about the rising crime rate. At 42, Dalton had been sheriff for 8 years, but lately the pressure was getting to him. His marriage was struggling, his teenage son barely spoke to him, and he'd been drinking more than he cared to admit. That morning, Dalton received another call about suspicious activity near the old warehouse district. By the time he arrived, whoever had been there was long gone, leaving behind only some scattered trash and his growing frustration. He sat in his patrol car for several minutes, rubbing his temples and trying to calm the anger that seemed to bubble up more frequently these days. Meanwhile, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell was driving through Millbrook with his loyal companion, Rex, a German shepherd who had served alongside him during 2 tours in Afghanistan. Mitchell had been medically discharged 6 months earlier after an IED explosion, left him with a permanent limp and ongoing struggles. With PTSD, he was on his way to a veterans support group meeting in the next town over. But Rex needed a break from the long drive. Rex was more than just Mitchell's former military working dog. He was his lifeline. The intelligent K-9 had been trained to detect Mitchell's anxiety attacks and help ground him during difficult moments. Their bond had been forged in the harsh realities of combat, where they had saved each other's lives more than once. Now in civilian life, Rex continued to provide the stability and companionship that Mitchell desperately needed. As Mitchell pulled into the parking lot of Ruby's Diner, he noticed the peaceful atmosphere of the small town. It reminded him of the community he had grown up in before enlisting, where people looked out for one another and problems were solved with conversation rather than confrontation. Rex stretched and yawned in the passenger seat, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the surroundings with the alertness that never fully left a military dog. Inside the diner, Ruby was dealing with a situation that had been building for weeks. Her arthritis had been particularly bad lately, making it difficult to move as quickly as she once did. Some customers had complained about slower service, and she'd accidentally mixed up a few orders. The stress was wearing on her, but she couldn't afford to hire additional help. And the diner was all she had left of her life with her deceased husband. Sheriff Dalton entered the diner with heavy footsteps, his mood dark and his patience thin. He had been a regular customer for years, but lately his interactions with Ruby had become increasingly tense. In his current state of mind, every small inconvenience felt like a personal attack, and his ability to maintain professional composure was rapidly deteriorating. The few other customers in the diner that morning included an elderly couple sharing breakfast, a young mother with her toddler, and a construction worker reading the newspaper while drinking coffee. The atmosphere was typically quiet and comfortable, with the gentle hum of conversation and the occasional clink of silverware against plates. Ruby approached Dalton's usual booth with a coffee pot and a tired but genuine smile. She had noticed his increasingly volatile behavior over the past few weeks, but attributed it to job stress. As a pillar of the community, she believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt and treating everyone with kindness, regardless of their current circumstances. Mitchell and Rex had just settled into a booth near the window when they noticed the tension beginning to build between the sheriff and the elderly diner owner. Mitchell's military training had taught him to quickly assess situations and identify potential threats or conflicts. Rex, sensing his handler's heightened awareness, positioned himself where he could observe both Mitchell and the developing situation across the room. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. What started as an ordinary Tuesday in a small town was about to become something that would change the lives of everyone present, setting in motion a series of events that would test the true character of each person involved and reveal the profound impact that a single moment of witnessed injustice could have on an entire community. Sheriff Dalton slumped into his usual booth, the vinyl creaking under his weight as he removed his hat and placed it on the table. His uniform was wrinkled from a sleepless night, and dark circles under his eyes betrayed the exhaustion he felt deep in his bones. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of pride and service, now felt heavy with the weight of mounting failures and community disappointment. Ruby approached with the coffee pot, her movements careful and deliberate as her arthritic joints protested with each step. She had known Marcus since he was a young deputy, fresh-faced and eager to serve his community. Over the years, she had watched him grow into his role, marry his high school sweetheart, and start a family. Lately, however, she had noticed the changes in his demeanor and the way stress seemed to eat away at his formerly optimistic outlook. The coffee poured into the white ceramic mug with a gentle splash, steam rising in delicate wisps. Ruby's hand trembled slightly, a combination of her medical condition and the early morning cold that seemed to settle in her bones more each passing winter. She had been fighting to maintain her independence and keep the diner running despite her declining health, unwilling to admit that age was finally catching up with her. Dalton looked up as she poured, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee that usually comforted him now seemed overwhelming to his already frayed senses. He had responded to a domestic disturbance call at 3 a.m, spent 2 hours dealing with paperwork, and returned home to find his wife already gone to work without leaving so much as a note. Ruby noticed his haggard appearance and felt a maternal concern rise in her chest. She had raised 3 children of her own and could recognize when someone was struggling, even if they were too proud to ask for help. Her voice carried the gentle warmth that had comforted countless customers over the decades when she spoke. The usual morning routine felt different today. Ruby moved more slowly than normal, and her hand shook noticeably as she attempted to steady the coffee pot. A few drops of hot coffee splashed onto the table, missing Dalton's hand by mere inches. In her younger days, such a minor mishap would have been quickly cleaned up with an apologetic smile, and perhaps a gentle joke to lighten the mood. Dalton's reaction was immediate and disproportionate to the small accident. His sleep-deprived mind, already pushed to its limits by work stress and personal problems, interpreted the spilled coffee as yet another example of the incompetence that seemed to surround him everywhere he looked. His jaw clenched as he stared at the small puddle of brown liquid spreading across the worn formica surface. The other customers in the diner continued their quiet conversations, unaware of the tension building at the sheriff's table. The elderly couple discussed their grandchildren's upcoming visit, while the young mother tried to convince her toddler to eat his pancakes. The construction worker turned the page of his newspaper, absorbed in the sports section and completely oblivious to the storm brewing just a few tables away. Mitchell observed the scene from his corner booth, his trained eye picking up on subtle changes in body language and atmosphere that most civilians would miss entirely. Years of military service had taught him to read situations quickly and accurately, skills that had kept him and his fellow soldiers alive in hostile environments. Rex sensed his handler's increased alertness and shifted position slightly, his own senses becoming more acute. Ruby reached for a clean cloth to wipe up the spilled coffee, her movements cautious as she tried not to aggravate her swollen joints. She began to apologize in the soft, grandmotherly tone that had soothed countless minor inconveniences over the years. Her words were sincere and heartfelt, carrying the genuine remorse of someone who took pride in providing excellent service, despite her physical limitations. The apology seemed to have the opposite effect on Dalton than Ruby intended. Instead of calming his rising anger, her words felt like salt in an open wound. In his current mental state, he heard condescension where there was only kindness, incompetence where there was only human frailty. His hands clenched into fists on the table as his breathing became shallow and rapid. Mitchell recognized the signs of someone on the edge of losing control. He had seen it in fellow soldiers pushed beyond their breaking point, in veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life, and unfortunately, in himself during his darkest moments. The rigid posture, the clenched fists, the way Dalton's eyes seemed to focus on everything, and nothing at once, all indicators that a dangerous line was about to be crossed. Rex's ears perked up as he detected the change in emotional energy within the diner. His specialized training allowed him to sense human distress and aggression in ways that most people couldn't perceive. The German Shepherd's body language shifted subtly, preparing for whatever might come next while maintaining the disciplined restraint that had been drilled into him during his military service. Ruby continued cleaning up the small spill, completely unaware that her simple act of trying to make things right was being perceived as a personal affront by the man she had known and served for years. Her focus remained on the task at hand, wiping the table with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to every aspect of running her diner. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension and mounting anger. Dalton's internal struggle played out in micro-expressions that Mitchell could read like a book. The tightening around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing became increasingly shallow. It was the face of a man standing at the precipice of making a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Other patrons remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding just feet away from them. The comfortable normalcy of their morning routines provided a stark contrast to the powder keg of emotion, threatening to explode at any moment. The gentle sounds of silverware against plates and quiet conversation created an almost surreal backdrop to the tension building between the elderly diner owner and the man sworn to protect and serve her community. The tension in the diner reached a breaking point as Ruby finished wiping the table and straightened up slowly, her movements hampered by the stiffness in her lower back. She offered Dalton a gentle smile, the same warm expression she had given thousands of customers over the years, completely unaware of the storm raging behind his eyes. Her weathered hands clutched the damp cloth as she prepared to return to her duties, expecting nothing more than the usual gruff acknowledgement she had grown accustomed to receiving from the increasingly moody sheriff. Dalton's internal pressure had been building for weeks, like steam in a kettle with no release valve. The mounting crime statistics, the town council's criticism, his crumbling marriage, and his son's resentful silence had created a perfect storm of frustration and anger. In that moment, looking at Ruby's apologetic face and her trembling hands, something inside him snapped with an almost audible crack. His voice erupted from his throat like a volcanic explosion, harsh and filled with venom that shocked even him as the words left his mouth. He berated her for her clumsiness, her age, her inability to perform the simple task of pouring coffee without making a mess. The words were cruel and cutting, designed to wound and humiliate, carrying the full weight of his accumulated rage and disappointment. Ruby stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck, her face draining of color as the verbal assault continued. In her 73 years, she had weathered many storms, raised children through difficult times, and buried the love of her life. But nothing had prepared her for this moment of pure, unprovoked cruelty from someone she had considered a friend and protector. The other customers in the diner began to take notice as Dalton's voice rose above the normal conversational hum. The elderly couple stopped discussing their grandchildren and turned worried glances toward the commotion. The young mother instinctively pulled her toddler closer, her maternal instinct sensing danger even before she fully understood what was happening. The construction worker looked up from his newspaper, confusion and concern evident in his expression. Mitchell's body tensed as he witnessed the verbal abuse unfold before his eyes. Every instinct told him to intervene, but his military training also taught him to assess the full situation before taking action. He could see that Ruby was hurt and frightened, but he also recognized the dangerous instability in Dalton's behavior that could escalate the situation beyond anyone's ability to control Rex, sensed the rising tension and shifted position to get a better view of what was happening. The German Shepherd's training in reading human behavior and detecting threats made him acutely aware that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. His intelligent eyes moved between Mitchell and the unfolding confrontation, waiting for a signal from his handler while remaining ready to respond to whatever might occur next. Ruby's hands began to shake more violently as Dalton's tirade continued. the coffee-stained cloth falling from her fingers to land on the floor beside her feet. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the cruelty of his words, but from the shock of seeing someone she had known for years transform into this angry, bitter stranger who seemed intent on destroying her dignity. The verbal assault reached its crescendo as Dalton rose from his seat, his imposing figure towering over the elderly woman who had shrunk back against the counter. His uniform, meant to represent protection and service, now seemed like armor worn by a bully intent on using his authority to intimidate and harm an innocent person who had done nothing more than experience a minor tremor in her aging hands. Other patrons began to murmur among themselves, their comfortable morning routine shattered by the display of aggression they were witnessing. Some looked toward the door, considering whether they should leave, while others seemed frozen in place by the shocking transformation of their community's chief law enforcement officer into someone they no longer recognized. Mitchell made eye contact with Rex, a silent communication that passed between the veteran soldier and his K-9 partner. They had developed this wordless understanding during their time in combat zones, where quick, quiet coordination could mean the difference between life and death. Rex responded with the slightest movement of his ears, acknowledging that he was ready for whatever his handler might ask of him. The culmination of Dalton's rage manifested in a moment that would forever change the lives of everyone present in the diner that morning. As Ruby cowered against the counter, her dignity stripped away by his cruel words, he raised his hand and struck her across the face with an open palm. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent diner like a gunshot, followed immediately by Ruby's small cry of pain and shock. The elderly woman stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek where a red mark was already beginning to form. The force of the blow, combined with her frail balance, caused her to lose her footing and fall against the counter, knocking over a display of fresh pies that crashed to the floor in a mess of broken dishes and scattered fruit filling. The diner fell into a stunned silence as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. A law enforcement officer sworn to protect and serve had just physically assaulted a defenseless elderly woman in front of multiple witnesses. The violation was so shocking, so completely contrary to everything the uniform was supposed to represent, that for a moment no one seemed able to process what they had just witnessed. Mitchell felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach as he watched Ruby struggle to regain her footing while holding her injured face. This was exactly the kind of abuse of power and victimization of the innocent that he and his fellow soldiers had fought to prevent in foreign lands. Yet here it was happening in a small American diner on a quiet Tuesday morning. Rex's body language shifted to high alert as he sensed his handler's emotional response to the violence they had just witnessed. The German Shepherd's training kicked in automatically, preparing him to support Mitchell through whatever actions he might need to take to address this clear threat to an innocent person's safety and well-being. The silence that followed the strike seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality it lasted only seconds. Ruby remained frozen against the counter, her hand pressed to her reddening cheek, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Never in her decades of serving the community had she experienced such violence, especially from someone wearing a badge sworn to protect her. The pain was sharp but temporary. The betrayal and humiliation would last much longer. Dalton stood over her, his hand still raised from the blow, breathing heavily as if he had just run a great distance. For a brief moment, reality seemed to crash down on him as he realized what he had done. The anger that had consumed him began to ebb, replaced by a growing horror at his own actions. But instead of stepping back, instead of apologizing, his pride and the presence of witnesses pushed him further down the path of justification. His voice, when it came, was cold and authoritative, attempting to reclaim control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond any reasonable response. He accused Ruby of being disrespectful, of failing to maintain proper standards in her establishment, of being a danger to public health with her shaking hands and declining abilities. Each word was calculated to shift blame away from his unconscionable actions and onto the victim of his assault. The other customers sat frozen in their seats, uncertain whether they should intervene, call for help, or simply flee from the increasingly dangerous situation. The elderly couple held hands tightly, their faces pale with fear as they witnessed the shocking transformation of their peaceful morning into something nightmarish. The young mother gathered her toddler into her arms, preparing to shield the child from any further violence. Mitchell felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments. But this was different from the chaos of war zones where enemies were clearly defined and rules of engagement were understood. This was a law enforcement officer abusing his power in front of witnesses, creating a complex situation where intervention could easily escalate into something far more dangerous for everyone involved. Rex sensed the change in his handler's physiology and moved closer, his presence providing the grounding effect that had helped Mitchell navigate countless difficult situations since their return to civilian life. The German Shepherd's training allowed him to recognize that his human needed support to make clear decisions in a high-stress environment where the wrong choice could have devastating consequences. Ruby finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion and shock. She asked Dalton why he had hit her, what she had done to deserve such treatment from someone she had known and served for years. Her words were soft and broken, carrying the weight of genuine confusion and hurt from a woman who had spent her life treating others with kindness and respect. Dalton's response was swift and brutal, cutting off her questions with another barrage of verbal abuse. He told her to shut up, to stop whining, to accept responsibility for her incompetence instead of playing the victim. His words were designed to break her spirit completely, to silence any potential complaints or testimony about what had occurred in the diner that morning. The construction worker at the far table slowly reached for his cell phone, intending to call for help but stopped when Dalton's cold gaze fell upon him. The sheriff's eyes carried an unmistakable threat, a clear message that anyone who interfered or reported what they had witnessed would face similar consequences. The implicit intimidation was as effective as any verbal threat, creating an atmosphere of fear that kept potential witnesses silent. Mitchell recognized the tactics immediately. He had seen similar behavior from corrupt officials and local strongmen in overseas deployments, individuals who used their authority to silence opposition and maintain control through fear and violence. The abuse of power was textbook intimidation, designed to ensure that victims remained silent and witnesses looked the other way. Ruby began to cry quietly, not from physical pain but from the complete destruction of her sense of safety and community trust. This was her diner, her safe haven where she had spent decades creating a welcoming environment for neighbors and friends. Now it felt contaminated by violence and cruelty, transformed from a place of comfort into a crime scene. Dalton seemed to feed off her distress, his earlier moment of doubt replaced by a sick satisfaction at having asserted his dominance. He leaned closer to Ruby, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only she could hear clearly. He warned her about what would happen if she reported the incident, describing in vivid detail how he could make her life miserable, how he could find violations and reasons to shut down her business. The threats were delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions, someone who believed his badge made him untouchable. He spoke of friends in city government, of health inspectors who owed him favors, of the many ways he could destroy everything she had worked to build if she dared to challenge his authority. Mitchell's hands clenched into fists under the table as he listened to the systematic intimidation of an elderly woman by someone sworn to protect her. Every fiber of his being wanted to stand up, to confront the bully, to protect the innocent just as he had done in military service. But he also understood that direct confrontation could escalate the situation beyond anyone's ability to control. Rex moved even closer to his handler, pressing against Mitchell's leg in a gesture of both support and readiness. The German Shepherd's acute senses picked up on every nuance of the threatening conversation, his training allowing him to understand the dangerous dynamics at play, even without comprehending the specific words being spoken. The young mother made the decision to leave, gathering her belongings and her child with shaking hands while trying not to draw attention to herself. She moved quickly toward the door, her maternal instincts overriding any thoughts of helping Ruby in favor of protecting her own vulnerable child from witnessing further violence. As she reached the exit, Dalton's voice stopped her cold. He told her to sit back down, that no one was leaving until he said they could go. The command was delivered with such cold authority that she froze mid-step, caught between her desire to flee and her fear of becoming the next target of his aggression. The diner had become a prison, with Dalton as the warden and everyone else as unwilling witnesses to his abuse of power. The situation had crossed far beyond a simple assault into the realm of unlawful detention and Systematic intimidation of multiple civilians by a law enforcement officer who had completely abandoned his oath to serve and protect. Mitchell made his decision with the calculated precision that had served him well in combat zones, where hesitation meant death and innocent lives hung in the balance. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, understanding that every gesture would be scrutinized by the unstable man with a badge who had just demonstrated his willingness to use violence against defenseless people. Rex rose alongside his handler, the German Shepherd's training automatically engaging as he sensed the shift from observation to action. The dog's posture remained calm but alert, his years of military service having taught him to project controlled readiness rather than aggression. His presence beside Mitchell added weight to the veteran's authority, without appearing overtly threatening. Dalton turned his attention to the approaching figure, his eyes narrowing as he assessed this new potential challenge to his dominance. He saw a man with a slight limp civilian clothes and what appeared to be a service dog. In his arrogance and current mental state, he dismissed Mitchell as just another small-town nobody who would back down when faced with his authority and the gun on his hip. Mitchell's voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced real danger and emerged intact. He identified himself as a Marine veteran and calmly but firmly told Dalton that what he was doing was wrong, that it needed to stop immediately. His words were measured and respectful, but carried an underlying steel that suggested he was not someone who could be easily intimidated. The sheriff's response was predictably aggressive, ordering Mitchell to mind his own business and return to his seat before he found himself under arrest for interfering with police business. Dalton's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, a gesture designed to reinforce his authority and remind everyone present that he held the ultimate power in this situation. Ruby watched the confrontation unfold with growing fear, terrified that her situation might result in violence against the stranger who was trying to help her. She attempted to speak, to tell Mitchell not to get involved for his own safety, but her voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat constricted by fear and the lingering shock of being assaulted. Mitchell stood his ground, his military bearing evident in the way he held himself despite his physical injuries. He explained calmly that he had witnessed an assault against an elderly civilian, and that as a citizen and veteran, he could not stand by and allow it to continue. His words were chosen carefully, acknowledging Dalton's authority while making it clear that some lines should never be crossed. The other customers watched in tense silence as the two men faced off, the atmosphere in the diner crackling with potential violence. The elderly couple clutched each other's hands tightly, while the construction worker seemed torn, between admiration for Mitchell's courage and fear of the consequences his intervention might bring upon all of them. Dalton's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at being challenged in front of witnesses. His authority, already damaged by his unconscionable behavior, was being further undermined by a civilian who refused to be intimidated. He stepped closer to Mitchell, using his size and uniform to project menace, but found himself facing someone who had stared down far more dangerous opponents in foreign combat zones. Rex remained perfectly still beside his handler, but those with experience around military working dogs could see the subtle signs of a highly trained animal ready to respond to threats against his human. The German Shepherd's ears were forward, his body balanced, and his intelligent eyes tracked every movement while remaining focused on Mitchell for any signal or command. Mitchell continued his calm but firm defense of Ruby, pointing out that she was an elderly woman who posed no threat to anyone and deserved protection rather than abuse from those sworn to serve her community. He spoke about the values that law enforcement was supposed to represent, about the oath to protect and serve that Dalton had clearly abandoned in favor of bullying and intimidation. The words struck home because they were true, and somewhere beneath his anger and justification, Dalton knew it. But rather than backing down or acknowledging his mistakes, he doubled down on his aggressive stance, threatening to arrest Mitchell for obstruction of justice, disorderly conduct, and any other charges he could think of to silence this unexpected opposition. Mitchell's response revealed the depth of his character and training. He informed Dalton that he was welcome to try to arrest him, but that doing so would require him to explain to his superiors, the district attorney, and eventually a judge, exactly why he had assaulted an elderly woman and then arrested the veteran who tried to protect her. The calm logic of his words made it clear that he understood the legal implications of the situation far better than Dalton had considered. The sheriff found himself in an increasingly untenable position. His initial act of violence had been witnessed by multiple people, and now his attempts at intimidation and cover-up were being systematically dismantled by someone who refused to be silenced. Every threat he made, every abuse of authority he attempted, only dug him deeper into a hole that would be difficult to escape. Ruby began to find her voice again, inspired by Mitchell's courage and protection. She straightened up slightly, still holding her injured cheek, and spoke more clearly about what had happened, confirming that she had done nothing to provoke the attack beyond accidentally spilling a few drops of coffee due to her arthritis. The construction worker, emboldened by Mitchell's example, began to speak up as well, stating that he had witnessed the entire incident and would be willing to testify about what he had seen. The elderly couple nodded in agreement, their fear beginning to give way to outrage at the injustice they had witnessed. Dalton realized that his attempts at intimidation had backfired completely. Instead of silencing witnesses, his aggressive behavior had created a group of people who were now united against him, led by a veteran who clearly had no intention of backing down. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and for the first time, he began to understand the serious consequences he might face for his actions. Mitchell maintained his calm demeanor throughout the confrontation, his military training helping him to de-escalate rather than inflame the situation. He spoke about accountability, about the importance of law enforcement maintaining the trust of the community, and about the need for those in authority to protect, rather than prey upon the vulnerable members of society they were sworn to serve. The standoff in Ruby's diner reached a critical moment, as Dalton realized his position was becoming increasingly indefensible. Multiple witnesses had now spoken up, led by a military veteran who clearly understood both the legal and moral implications of what had transpired. The sheriff's face cycled through various emotions as he grappled with the reality that his moment of uncontrolled rage had created consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. Mitchell maintained his steady gaze, neither advancing nor retreating, his presence serving as a protective barrier between Ruby and any further aggression from the man who had already proven his willingness to abuse his authority. Rex remained perfectly positioned beside his handler, a living reminder that Mitchell was not just any civilian, but someone who had served his country with distinction and earned the loyalty of a highly trained military working dog. Ruby found strength in the support surrounding her and began to speak more clearly about the incident, describing how she had been simply doing her job when the sheriff had exploded into violence without provocation. Her voice grew stronger with each word as she realized she was no longer alone in facing down the man who had assaulted her. The red mark on her cheek stood as visible evidence of Dalton's unprovoked attack on an innocent elderly woman. The construction worker had pulled out his cell phone and was openly recording the aftermath of the incident, making it clear that any further threats or violence would be documented and shared beyond the confines of the diner. The elderly couple spoke up about what they had witnessed, their voices shaky but determined to ensure that justice was served for the unconscionable attack they had seen. Dalton's desperation began to show as he realized that his attempts at intimidation had not only failed, but had actually strengthened the resolve of the witnesses against him. He threatened to have everyone arrested for interfering with police business, but his words rang hollow in the face of the obvious illegality of his own actions and the growing documentation of his behavior. Mitchell calmly pulled out his own phone and dialed 911, requesting that additional law enforcement officers respond to the diner to investigate an assault by a police officer against a civilian. His voice was steady and professional as he provided the dispatcher with clear, factual information about what had occurred, making no inflammatory statements, but simply reporting the criminal behavior he had witnessed. The young mother, who had been frozen near the door, began to realize that the situation was turning in favor of justice rather than continued intimidation. She moved back toward the group of witnesses, her protective instincts for her child now balanced by her civic duty to ensure that the truth about Dalton's behavior was properly documented and reported. Rex sensed the shift in dynamics and remained vigilant but calm, his training allowing him to read the reduced threat level while maintaining his protective stance near Mitchell. The German Shepherd's presence continued to provide both moral support for his handler and a subtle reminder to Dalton that he was facing someone with serious backing and training. Dalton made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative, claiming that Ruby had been disrespectful and that he had simply been maintaining order in response to her behavior. But his explanation fell flat in the face of multiple witness accounts and the obvious disproportion between spilling a few drops of coffee and being physically assaulted by a law enforcement officer. The sound of approaching sirens began to filter through the diner's windows as additional police units responded to Mitchell's emergency call. Dalton's face went pale as he realized that his colleagues would soon arrive to investigate his conduct, that he would have to explain his actions to fellow officers who would be duty-bound to enforce the law regardless of their personal relationships with him. Mitchell remained calm as the backup units arrived, knowing that the situation would now be handled through proper legal channels rather than the chaos and intimidation that Dalton had attempted to create. He prepared to give his statement as a witness, understanding that his military background and credibility would carry significant weight in any subsequent investigation. Ruby felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that help was finally arriving. While she was grateful for the protection and support she had received from Mitchell and the other witnesses, she also worried about the potential backlash from Dalton's friends in local government and law enforcement. Her small business depended on community support, and she feared that speaking out against a sheriff, even one who had assaulted her, might bring unwanted consequences. The first responding officers entered the diner with professional caution, immediately assessing the scene and the various individuals present. Their trained eyes took in Ruby's injured face, the broken dishes scattered on the floor, and the tense standoff between their colleague and the group of witnesses who had clearly united against him. The lead officer, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, had 20 years of experience and could immediately sense that something serious had occurred. Mitchell stepped forward to identify himself and provide a clear, factual account of what he had witnessed. His military bearing and calm demeanor immediately established his credibility with the responding officers, who recognized the bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with serious situations under pressure. Rex remained at his side, the German Shepherd's presence adding weight to Mitchell's testimony and serving as a visual reminder of his service record. Dalton attempted to control the narrative by claiming that he had been responding to a disturbance at the diner, and that the witnesses were exaggerating a minor incident. But his explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory, as multiple witnesses provided consistent accounts of his unprovoked assault on Ruby and subsequent intimidation of everyone present. The construction worker showed the video he had recorded on his phone, capturing Dalton's threats and aggressive behavior in the aftermath of the initial assault. The recording provided undeniable evidence of the sheriff's abuse of authority and his attempts to silence witnesses through intimidation and illegal detention. Sergeant Rodriguez took statements from each witness individually, carefully documenting their accounts and photographing Ruby's injuries as evidence of the assault. The professionalism of the responding officers stood in stark contrast to Dalton's behavior, demonstrating how law enforcement was supposed to conduct itself when investigating crimes and protecting victims. The elderly couple, despite their initial fear, provided detailed testimony about what they had observed, their voices growing stronger as they realized they were speaking to officers who took their concerns seriously. Their account corroborated every detail of the other witnesses' statements, creating an overwhelming case against Dalton's version of events. Ruby, supported by the presence of so many people willing to stand up for her, finally found the courage to make a formal complaint against Dalton for assault and abuse of authority. Her voice trembled as she described the attack, but her words were clear and detailed, providing the legal foundation necessary for criminal charges to be filed against the man who had betrayed his oath to protect and serve. The young mother added, her testimony about Dalton's attempts to prevent her from leaving the diner, corroborating the charges of unlawful detention and intimidation that would be added to the growing list of criminal allegations against the disgraced sheriff. Her protective instincts for her child gave her the strength to ensure that justice was pursued. As the investigation proceeded, it became clear that Dalton's career in law enforcement was over. The evidence against him was overwhelming, provided by credible witnesses and supported by physical evidence and video recording. His badge and service weapon were removed, and he was informed that he would face both criminal charges and internal affairs investigation. Mitchell watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his decision to intervene had helped protect an innocent woman and hold a corrupt officer accountable for his actions. Rex sensed his handler's emotional relief and moved closer, providing the comforting presence that had helped Mitchell navigate the challenges of civilian life after military service. The diner, which had been transformed into a crime scene by Dalton's violence, slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy as the investigation concluded and the disgraced sheriff was led away. Ruby stood among the broken dishes and scattered pie filling, surveying the damage to her restaurant and beginning to process the traumatic events that had changed her quiet morning into a nightmare she would never forget. 3 months after the incident at Ruby's diner, the small town of Millbrook was still processing the shocking events that had shattered their sense of security and trust in local law enforcement. The trial of former Sheriff Marcus Dalton had concluded just 2 weeks earlier, resulting in his conviction on charges of assault, abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and intimidation of witnesses. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours before reaching their unanimous verdict. Ruby Henderson stood in her renovated diner, which had been closed for 6 weeks following the assault while she recovered both physically and emotionally from the trauma. The community had rallied around her during the closure, with local businesses and residents contributing to a fund that covered her medical expenses, lost income, and the cost of repairs and improvements to the restaurant. The physical renovations were impressive, with new equipment, fresh paint, and updated fixtures that made the diner more modern while preserving its classic small-town charm. But the most significant changes were less visible, including a security camera system and emergency alert buttons that would ensure Ruby never again faced danger alone and unprotected in her own establishment. Mitchell had become a regular customer during the diner's reopening, often stopping by with Rex for coffee and conversation during his travels between veteran support group meetings. The bond formed during that terrible morning had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to stand up for what was right when doing so carried personal risk. Rex had become something of a local celebrity, with children and adults alike eager to meet the heroic German shepherd who had stood alongside his handler during the confrontation with Dalton. The intelligent dog seemed to understand his elevated status in the community, carrying himself with dignified pride while maintaining the gentle demeanor that made him perfect for therapeutic work with veterans. Ruby had initially struggled with anxiety and fear following the assault, finding it difficult to trust customers and feeling jumpy whenever someone raised their voice or moved too quickly near her. But with the support of counseling services and the encouragement of friends like Mitchell, she had gradually rebuilt her confidence and sense of security within her own establishment. The trial had been a difficult experience for all the witnesses, requiring them to relive the traumatic events through detailed testimony and cross-examination by Dalton's defense attorney. But their solidarity and mutual support had seen them through the process, and the guilty verdict had provided a sense of justice and closure that helped the healing process begin. Dalton himself had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, permanently barred from law enforcement, and ordered to pay restitution to Ruby for her medical expenses and lost income. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing remarks, noting that law enforcement officers who abuse their authority betray not only their victims, but the entire community they were sworn to protect. The local police department had undergone significant reforms, following the scandal, with new leadership, enhanced training programs, and improved oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses of authority. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had professionally handled the investigation, had been promoted to interim chief while the department searched for permanent leadership committed to rebuilding community trust. Mitchell had been recognized by several veteran organizations for his courage in protecting a vulnerable civilian, but he remained modest about his actions, insisting that he had simply done what any decent person should do when witnessing injustice. His intervention had inspired other veterans in the area to become more active in community protection and support activities. The other witnesses from that morning had also been changed by their experience. The elderly couple had become advocates for elderly rights and protection, speaking at community meetings about the vulnerability of aging residents and the need for better support systems. The construction worker had started a neighborhood watch program in his area, determined to ensure that other potential victims would have protection and support. The young mother had channeled her experience into becoming active in local government, running for city council on a platform of police accountability and community safety. Her campaign had been successful, and she now served as a voice for families and vulnerable residents in municipal decision-making processes. Ruby's diner had reopened to a line of customers stretching around the block, with people coming from neighboring towns to show their support for the brave elderly woman who had stood up to corruption and abuse. The reopening celebration had been covered by regional media, turning Ruby into something of a folk hero for victims of abuse everywhere. Mitchell often reflected on how a simple stop for coffee had led to one of the most significant moments of his civilian life. The incident had reminded him that the values he had fought for overseas, justice, protection of the innocent, and standing up to bullies, were just as important and relevant in his hometown as they had been in foreign combat zones. Rex continued to provide therapeutic support for Mitchell, but the dog's role had expanded to include visits with other veterans and community members who needed the comfort and stability that only a well-trained therapy animal could provide. The German Shepherd's gentle nature and heroic reputation made him perfect for this expanded mission of service. As Ruby served coffee to her morning customers, including Mitchell and Rex at their usual table by the window, she marveled at how much had changed since that terrible Tuesday morning. The diner was busier than ever, the community was stronger and more vigilant, and she had discovered reserves of strength and courage she never knew she possessed. The incident had taught everyone involved that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to stand up for what was right. Mitchell's courage in protecting a stranger had inspired an entire community to examine their own values and commitment to justice, creating ripple effects that would benefit vulnerable residents for years to come. The small town of Millbrook had learned that true security came not from badges and authority, but from neighbors looking out for one another, and good people refusing to stand by when evil occurred in their presence. The lesson had been expensive and traumatic, but the stronger community that emerged from the crisis proved that sometimes the most terrible moments could lead to the most meaningful positive changes.